Hi, Enquadrando Tradutor is an interview program of the Post-Graduation in Translation Studies at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Every edition, the program counts with the presence of a translator or specialist. Our guest here today is Professor Patrick O'Neill. Thank you very much, Professor, for being here with us today.
Pleasure.
Professor Patrick O'Neill is Professor Emeritus of Queen's University in Canada, Doctor of Literature, PhD in German Language and Literature. He wrote Polyglot Joyce, Fictions of Translation, Impossible Joyce, Finnegan's Wakes, and Trilingual Joyce, Diana Livia Variations.
Good morning, Professor O'Neill. First, we would like to talk a little bit about the beginning of your research. So, what was the starting point of your work with James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake?
Right, well, I was a professor of German, of course, more or less by accident for more than 40 years, so I did not have too much time to work on Joyce. I had read, I think I started with Dubliners and then Ulysses back in the 1960s, 50 odd years ago, and Finnegan's Wake, I think, as a graduate student. But of course I had to think primarily about German things, teaching graduate courses, going to conferences and so on. So it was really only as I approached retirement, which came in 2012, that I began to think of going back to my Irish roots and working on Joyce. I had done a fair amount of comparative work between German and Irish writing. I did a book called Ireland and Germany back in 1985, I think it was. But in 1993, I think it was, I decided I would devote myself now primarily to Joyce, and I did.
That's great. In your first book on Joyce, Joyce and Translation, Polyglot Joyce, Fictions on Translation, published in 2005, you offered a translational history of Joyce's text. Do you think you would have to add many other translations if you were to write it in 2019? So, I mean, are there many new translations since you did this first?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are many new translations. I was just looking at Caetano Galindo's Portuguese translation of Dubliners just this morning, looking at his bibliography. I think there were at least 4 new translations of Dubliners that have appeared since 2005 in Brazil alone.
Wow.
So yes, it would be a much longer book now. However, I don't think there is any publisher out there who would be publishing a second edition of it.
Well, I think in your last books on Finnegan's Wake, you compare translations of Joyce's last novel in several languages. What are the challenges of this kind of methodology? Do you write to the translators to ask questions? How do you work with this material?
No, normally I did not write to translators. I simply sat down with the various translations. I've always been fascinated by language. I've always been fascinated by words. And there are, of course, many dictionaries out there, and now on the internet as well, there are all kinds of support. So no, basically I sat down with the original and with the French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and other translations in other languages, and it was a huge amount of fun. It was a lot of fun.
With Finnegan's Wake?
Yeah, with Finnegan's Wake, yes, and even with Ulysses and Dubliners and Portrait. But no, I did not normally approach translators.
Okay. In your last book about Finnegan's Wake, Trilingual Joyce, Diana Livia Variations, published in 2018, you present a profile of James Joyce as a translator. Could you comment a little more about the kind of translator he was?
Well, he certainly was not a translator who wished to give a completely accurate rendering in French or in Italian of the original English text. I think it's quite obvious that he saw the process not as merely making the original text easily available to a reader in French or Italian, but rather in continuing the text. There are various examples of his writing Finnegan's Wake and even Ulysses before the translations, where he quoted a passage to somebody who said, "This is very good," and he said, "No, it's not complex enough yet, I've got to make it more difficult." And that was certainly the way he worked in the Italian. The French translation is a team effort. Initially begun by Samuel Beckett and his friend Alfred Perron. Joyce, when they had completed enough of the translation to send it to the journal and it had reached the page-proof stage, Joyce told them to withdraw it, which must have been very irritating for the two young men. They were both in their early 20s. But Joyce had become fascinated clearly by the idea of translation himself. So he gathered a team of translators around him for the French translation, not all of them French, but most of them French. And they worked steadily for, I think, something like 45 hours altogether. 10 years later, he was still obviously delighted with the success of the French translation, which appeared in the Nouvelle Revue Française in May 1931. 7 years later, he suggested to an Italian friend, Nino Frank, that they might try translating the Italian. Frank said, "No, not really a good idea. Italian does not lend itself to puns, and certainly not to Joycean puns." But Joyce insisted, and Frank was eventually persuaded that this was a good thing to do. But in the Italian version, Joyce really flew free, you might say, of the original, where some of the passages are simply not translations anymore of the original English at all, but rather phrasings which are presumably intended to give a similar kind of reading experience to the reader. So certainly not a translator who wanted to stick to the original text, but rather one who wanted to dance with the text.
The relationship between James Joyce and Samuel Beckett is not unknown. He worked closely to Joyce and even assisted him during the writing of Finnegan's Wake. Beckett also wrote the famous essay Dante Bruno Vico Joyce, stating how the reference of these great thinkers are applied in Finnegan's Wake. In the text, Beckett writes, "Here form is content, content is form. You complain that the stuff is not written in English. It's not written at all. It's not to be read, or rather, it's not only to be read, it's to be looked at and listened to. His writing is not about something, is that something itself." Can you expand on that statement to comment the importance of visual and sound effects in Finnegan's Wake?
Yes, absolutely. If you try reading Finnegan's Wake from beginning to end, hoping to find a coherent story, you will, of course, be disappointed very quickly by about the end of line 2 on the first page. It is, you might say, a performance in language. That's a famous statement of Beckett's. Finnegan's Wake is not about something, it is that something itself. Beckett was very closely associated with Joyce. He came to Paris as a very young man. He was 22 years of age. He had just graduated from Trinity College in Dublin. Anna Livia Plurabelle had been published in English for the first time in October 1928. Beckett came to Paris just a year later, was introduced to Joyce very quickly by Thomas McGreevy, who was a friend of his and an acquaintance of Joyce's. And Joyce became quickly intrigued by the idea of translating Anna Livia, or more accurately, of discovering whether it was translatable at all, which again goes back to Beckett's notion that this wasn't about something, it was something. Joyce initially decided he would do a French translation of the closing lines together with the French poet Léon-Paul Fargue. This didn't work out, and he then turned to a German translator, Georg Goyert, who had translated Ulysses into German. Goyert made a start on on a German translation, and we have Joyce, after a few months, writing to Goyet, saying, could I see part of your translation, please, to find out if this is translatable at all. We're not entirely sure whether Goyet responded to that or not. The political situation in Germany was becoming more and more difficult in the early 30s as it became evident that the Nazis were going to come into power quickly. They did come into power. Hitler became chancellor in 1933. Goyet finished his translation of Anna Livia Plurabelle the same year, but it basically got lost until 1970 when it was finally published. It was after he had asked Goyet to do the German translation that Joyce asked Beckett to do the French translation together with his friend. And then the next stage was, as I said in answer to the last question, he became fascinated with the idea of doing the translation himself. Now this is 1929. Finnegan's Wake did not appear until 10 years later, in 1939, so we are very much in the writing process of Finnegan's Wake at this point. Joyce very clearly intended, even at this early stage, to include many languages other than English in the text, and to that extent, translation itself became very important to him. So those translations, especially the French and the Italian translation of Anna Livia, play a really interesting role in the development, in the progression of Finnegan's Wake. That's a rather long-winded answer to the question, but I hope it covers some of the points.
Samuel Beckett and Alfred Perron began the translation, like you said, of ALP to French under the supervision of Joyce. You wrote about this in Beckett, Perron, Joyce, and the Strange Case of French ALPs, published in the Corpus magazine. In Beckett's letters to Thomas McGreevy, he stated how hard it was to translate, showing an exhausting and antagonistic feeling towards translation. Beckett's going to keep this sentiment while translating his own work. Regarding all the trouble to have a French translation of ALP, what can Joyce translators take from these experiences?
Well, they can certainly realize that, yes, this is going to be very, very difficult. There is an interesting case in 1932. A Czech translator, Adolf Hofmeister, visited Joyce in Paris and asked for permission to translate Anna Livia Plurabelle into Czech. And Joyce said, well, you know, it's going to be very difficult. Very difficult. In fact, it's pretty well impossible to translate. Presumably, of course, while he had been enthusiastic about the possibility of a French and German translation, and later an Italian translation, he spoke all three of these languages, but he did not speak Czech, so he would have no control over the final version of the text. But his warning to Hofmeister was indicative. Anna Livia Plurabelle is possibly one of the easier in fact it is one of the easier chapters in Finnegan's Wake to read, but it is certainly not easy to read, and it is even more certainly not easy to translate into any other language. Beckett, we have several letters from him to Thomas McGreevy and also to Philippe Soupeau, the French poet who was coordinating Beckett and Perron's translation, saying, this is impossible. I'm quite sure that Joyce is going to be disgusted with our feeble attempts with our bastard French attempts to translate his text into any other language. It was an extremely difficult piece of work, so it must have been all the more irritating to Beckett and to Perron when Joyce calmly said, okay, thank you very much, now you withdraw this, okay? Beckett was not pleased. And even though he maintained a friendship, I'm not sure friendship is the right word, because Joyce did not have very many friends. He had acquaintances, and he certainly had admirers. But he once told Beckett, I love only three people, my wife, my son, and my daughter. The implication was clear. You're not included in that three. He was a very private man, Joyce. But Beckett was very much tempted to abandon the translation altogether. His friend Perron had been his French language teacher for 2 years in Trinity College, Dublin. Trinity College had an exchange arrangement with the École Normale Supérieure, which Perron had graduated from. Perron went to Trinity in Dublin for 2 years. The two young men became friends. But Perron, as a true Parisian, wanted to take his month-long holiday in August and go away with his then girlfriend, whom he later married. Beckett was completely appalled by this. He was going to be left in Paris all on his own with a deadline looming and with this impossible text to translate. He was not happy.
Based on your experience with comparative work, especially of translations, what are your thoughts on retranslation?
I'm not sure there is such a thing as retranslation. After all, the term retranslation should mean translating a translation, which is not usually what translators sit down to do. At least one would hope that they don't. So I'm, despite Vitor, I'm not sure there is such a thing as retranslation. There are new translations, of course, of the text, and new translations will mirror the state of the language and the state of the culture of the target language. Obviously, a translation of Anna Livia Plurabelle made in 1929 or in German in 1933 would have been far less familiar with the kind of literary techniques and literary tricks that Joyce used. And so in German, for example, two new translations of Anna Livia Plurabelle appeared in 1970, together with Goyert's 1933 translation. They were in the same volume. And the differences between them were very significant. The two modern translators, Hildesheimer and Wollschläger, were asked to do their translations independently without any consultation. So it is very interesting for a German speaker to read the three translations and compare them. And the two modern translations are obviously much more sophisticated, much more complex than the 1933 translation. Does this necessarily mean that they're better? Well, not in every way, no, because Goyert, for example, had a very good sense of rhythm. And so in many places in those three translations, which I am pretty familiar with, Goyert gives a better rhythmical version of Joyce's own. Joyce himself was fascinated by the rhythm of his language too, as you can see from the passage from Anna Livia that he recorded in his fake Irish accent. That accent was not his normal accent. But retranslation, I'm doubtful about the term. These were not retranslations, they were new translations.
And can you talk a little bit about the work you are developing now, your new project, or what you are working currently on Joyce?
Well, I'm very old and I'm not sure how many years I have left. But what I'm going to do now is, to some extent, going back to the notion of polyglot choice. That is to say, looking at translations of Finnegan's Wake in as many languages as I can find, not just the complete translations, of which there are 14 at the moment. Even though the text is untranslatable, there are 14 translations, or at any rate, translations, transfigurations, transcreations, transformations of it. But also there are really interesting transfigurations of very tiny parts, very tiny sentences. Like in French, for example, André Dubouché in 1950, and again in 1957, and again in 1962, did translations, very short pieces from Finnegan's Wake in a very sophisticated way. Boucher was a very fine poet, Du Boucher. And of course, the Campos brothers here in Brazil, similarly, first of all in 1957 in the newspaper version, and then in 1962 in Panorama. I want to look at translations in every language that I can find, including Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Now, can I say anything about these translations? No, because I don't speak any of those languages. Will that stop me? No, because there are people out there who can. There are reviewers who say one thing about the translation. There are other reviewers who will say another thing about the translation. And in some cases, I will just make a note and say this passage was translated into Korean. And in others, I will probably do something like an article on the translation. It's a fascinating project. It will almost certainly see me into the grave, but I can hope that it will be published posthumously. It won't make me rich.
Thank you very much, Professor. This was Enquadrando Tradutor.
Thank you very much, Larissa.
Thank you very much, Professor Patrick.
Thank you both for inviting me. It gives me a chance to talk without interruption.
Brilliant.
These are the final lines of Finnegan's Wake, and Olivia is passing out, both as a now old woman who has slipped away before her family are up, and as a river that flows into the Irish Sea, into the arms of her husband, her father, only to come back again at the very beginning of the book. I'm passing out, oh bitter ending. I'll slip away before they're up. They'll never see, nor know, nor miss me. And it's old and old, it's sad and old, it's sad and weary I go back to you, my cold father, my cold mad father, my cold mad fiery father, till the near sight of the mere size of him, the moils and moils of it, moan and owning, makes me sea silt salt sick, and I rush my only into your arms. I see them rising. Save me from those terrible prongs. 2 more. 1, 2 moments more. So, Ave Laval. My leaves have drifted from me, all, but one clings still. I'll bear it on me, to remind me of so soft this morning, hours, yes. Carry me along, Daddy, like you'd done through the toy fair. If I seen him bearing down on me now under white-spread wings like he'd come from archangels, I think I'd dive down over his feet, humbly, dumbly, only to wash up. Yes, Teed, there's where. First, we pass through grass, we hush the bush to whish a gull. Gulls, far calls, coming far, end here. Us then, Finnegan, take, puss softly, remember me, till thousands thee. Lips, keys to given, away, alone, a last, a loved, a long, but
Eis que se elevam, salve-me desses tríveis tridentes, dos más únidos ou momentos mais. Só, avelabo, minhas folhas derivam de mim, todas. Só esta me resta. Paro e porto comigo, para a remembrança de Lif. Suave esta manhã, tanto, a nossa. Sim, leva-me contigo, papito, como quando quedos percorremos a feira dos brinquedos. Se eu visse baixar sobre mim, sob suas alva-estendidas asas, como que vindo de arcângelos, penso que pensa findaria os meus pés, úmil, dúbio, débil, laudante. Sim, tá em tempo. Cá estamos. Início. Passamos postagens. Vasculhem o bosque. Vou. gaivota, gaivotas, apelos do pai, já vou, pai, eis o fim, nós então, fim revém, toma serenamente, rememora-me, take thousands, lips, as chaves a, castem, a via lenta, leve, alerta, longa, a.